I was born in eastern Montana in my parents' homestead house. It was 25 miles from the nearest town, which was Terry, Montana, and 5 miles at least from the nearest neighbor. Well, the ranchers called it Cherry Creek. The ranchers who lived there called it Cherry Creek. And I remember there were 2 families that lived about 5 miles away, but they weren't in sight from the homestead house. I was born in 1915, and the railroad had just come in and offered land to people who wanted to homestead. By homesteading, you were required to establish a place to live and to live there and show some evidence that you were going to continue living there and make a home. My mother and father both grew up in different communities in South Dakota. My father's family farm was near Bristol, South Dakota, and my mother's family home was near Webster, South Dakota. And they played baseball. The different groups would meet on weekends or on Sundays, and Sunday afternoon, maybe Saturday, and have baseball games. My father's family had 9 kids, and he was the oldest, and my mother's family had 11, and she was the youngest. But my father, I think, was the manager of the baseball, his team, and he had 2 of his brothers. One was pitcher and one was catcher. And my mother used to go to the games. Now, I don't know that they played against each other, that the community. My father's community was a Swedish community, though my father was English-Scotch, but his mother was Swedish, so her brothers called him block-headed Swede, like all those other Swedes. And but she saw him as a pretty good-looking guy who had a good laugh, and I think that his sister and my mother's brother also met at the baseball games, because they had a double wedding and were married at the same time. And her name was Mildred, I suppose, and his was Edward. My dad's name was Edwin, so there were 2 Eds. And when they were married, they all went out to my dad's homestead for their honeymoon. And Millie and Ed stayed 2 weeks, I think it was. And then they went back to his family farm, which he took over then. And my mother and dad stayed on their homestead. And my mother told, on her 70th wedding anniversary, she was no longer, my father had died by that time, but we were asking her, she liked to tell stories about the homestead and about their experiences. So we asked her to tell us about the wedding and their trip to the homestead, and she made a tape for us, which we were very happy to have. She told how after the dinner, they had a big dinner at her family home, and then a neighbor or somebody took them down to Webster. They had time to have pictures taken, and I should have had one ready to show you, I think, of the double wedding. And then they also had dinner at a restaurant, because there were no meals on the plane, of course. The plane had 1 passenger car on a freight train, and wooden seats of some sort, you know, on this to sit on. No sleeping cars, of course. And so they traveled all night. They got in the morning, and my father picked up his livery wagon and horses at the livery barn, which I guess was the long-term parking of that day. and they got their trunks that had been shipped out. So they put the trunks in the back of the car and put a board across the two trunks. So one couple sat on the trunks and the other couple sat in the seat up front. And when my mother would tell this story, I would tease her and say, "I bet you like sitting in the back so you could smooch." And she would say, "We didn't do that in those days." And then it took them all day, that 25 miles, you know, driving with horse and wagon, to get out to the homestead. And I think they stopped at somebody's ranch along the way, and they were fed. But other than that, they got in the evening, and they knew that there would be a shivaree, because that's what people did in those days. They made a big noise when somebody got married. And she said, sure enough, as soon as it got dark, there was a big noise outside and banging on the door, and some cowboy wanted to see the bride. So they told him they had two brides. So my mother would tell primly that then those cowboys hugged them and kissed them and made them feel like fools. And then my dad invited them in. He says, we have treats. And he had, ahead of time, he had made sure he had candy and soda pops. He said no liquor. They didn't have any hard liquor for the party. But the cowboy said, just a minute. And they all left for a little while, and pretty soon they came back with a big crowd, women with food, baskets of food, and all the neighbors. And they partied all night. And so I thought, you know, here were these two honeymoon couples. She says they were pretty tired, and this homestead house had 3 rooms. So curious kids, of course, would say, what did you do with Millie and Ed? You know, where did you put them? And she says, well, we had another box of springs, and so we just made a bed in the living room, front room. They called the living room the front room. And so that was their room while they stayed. And I was sure that they managed to not do much smooching the night of their wedding, because they were pretty tired all night on the train, and then all night partying. But I often wondered if they didn't. Of course, parents don't at that time don't share this. They didn't share that kind of intimate relationships with their kids. But of course, we were curious. My brother, their firstborn, was born December 10th. And one time when she was telling this, they were married March 5th. One time when she was telling this, my brother was, you know, using his fingers. I know he was counting up the months. And she saw him and she said, it's all right, you were legal. Or you were legitimate. And he was born December 10th, and our cousin Crystal, Millie and Ed's firstborn, was December 25th. And I'm sure there must have been some bragging about that, wouldn't you think? They communicated back and forth with postcards. Postcards were mostly, they were pictures that they could take on a camera. Did you know that they could do that at that time? There was so little that they had that we have now that this is a marvel to me, because she saved many of these postcards, and postcards that she wrote back to the family. They must have saved and given back to her, because I have several that she had written. Would have 1 or 2 sentences of what was going on in their lives, and that was their total communication. There were no telephones, of course, and they could send wire, but that would get a telegram. That would get from Webster to Terry in a matter of hours, I suppose. But then they would have to find some rancher from Cherry Creek who would be going out in order to take it out to whoever got the telegram. I remember them getting a telegram once, and it was a very serious thing when you got a telegram, because you knew that somebody had died, because otherwise nobody would use that kind of. But they didn't seem to be concerned about, I wondered about my mother's mother, seeing her youngest child leave and go out to what would seem to her the boondocks, uncivilized territory, and without knowing that she wouldn't see her again. Another thing, she did not read or write English. She had immigrated when she was 5 years old, and from Germany, and my grandfather had immigrated from Switzerland as a very young child, and he could read and write English, but she had never learned, and so she would not even be able to write back and forth with her daughter. They were able to send her a letter because my father had had 3 years of college in South Dakota State College at Brookings, South Dakota, and had taken a little German. Now, why he took German, whether he knew at that time he was going to marry this little German woman, but he would write for her. She would dictate to him, and he would write for her once in a while to her mother in German. But other than that, they had no way of communicating. But they did go back and forth a few times. They would get on the train and go back to Webster and stay a while and then come back again. When my mother was due to have her first baby, she had a sister who was 12 years older, who was, I suspect, more of a mother than her mother, because by that time her mother was probably pretty tired of having these babies and was glad to have one of the older girls take over. And her sister Anna probably did more as a mother than as a sister. She was a very bright woman who had managed to get nurses training and had her own hospital. She ran a hospital in Webster. And and my mother had been in the hospital for a while taking nurses training, but not with the idea that she would become a nurse, because they didn't expect that of her, I guess. Anyway, my aunt was not very happy about her having a baby out there in the territory, and so she went back to Webster, and Clinton was born. My brother was born in her hospital. And I'm sure that she got back to her Homestead home as fast as she could, because that's where her heart was. She really, really loved being there and didn't like being anyplace else, and she was perfectly happy to take her. She must have felt very confident in taking her baby 25 miles from town and doing it her way, being boss of herself. Less than 2 years later, a year and 6 months as a matter of fact, I was born. And she decided that she would not go back to South Dakota. So my Aunt Anna, who we always called Auntie, Auntie took a vacation from her hospital and came to Terry. And I got the information a lot from postcards on what was happening. When I was in college, my father wrote me a wonderful letter at the time of close to my birthday, as a birthday greeting he wrote and told me about. And I saved that letter for a long time, but I haven't been able to find it lately, about my birth, what happened on that. And he went into Terry on horseback to alert the doctor, and I'm sure they allowed for 12 hours labor pains, but I have a feeling that he went in before that. But it was the middle of June, and it was the one year when they got some rain. They didn't get lots of rain in eastern Montana, but that year they had lots of rain, and when it rained, it rained all at once, so that the creeks flooded and they made going and coming pretty difficult. So he got into the doctor, but the doctor got into his buggy and started out, but he was delayed, so that he didn't get there in time for my birth. My aunt delivered me and put me in a clothes basket with bottles of hot water around the outside, sort of like a incubator, I guess, even though I was full weight. But they always loved the story of how the doctor got there for breakfast, and I was born without his help. And though my mother really didn't believe that that was the proper way to do things, that she had a lot of idea about what was proper and what wasn't, and it wasn't proper to have too easy a birth. That wasn't very ladylike. Shaking them out of your sleeve, as she would say, was a little indecent. You were supposed to suffer a bit, I guess. And so she did it the right way. She had her full 12 hours of labor and never complained about it afterwards. And my aunt stayed for a short time, and then she went back to her hospital. And my mother was left with 2 babies under 2 years. Let's see, Clinton was not 2 yet. And that was fine with her, as she told it later. Now, at the time, it might have been more difficult than she would talk about it later. Then in a year and 9 months later, another baby. So that time, she did not go back to South Dakota again, and Anna didn't come. So she went to Terry and boarded with, when the time came close, and boarded with a woman who did this, who had rooms for ranchers' wives who were going to have babies, and until the birth and for a short time afterwards. And so she tried that, and oh, she was so unhappy. She would tell about how unhappy she was because she couldn't have her 2 babies with her. And it was, I think there was smallpox alert about that time, and both of the little kids, her 2 toddlers, had to be vaccinated for smallpox, and she sent them home back to the ranch with their father with their smallpox vaccination. And she said when she'd tell it, she would say, "Your father was a wonderful father. He was the most wonderful father that ever was. But at that age, children need their mother." And so she was very happy to get home to her homestead house that she dearly loved, and with 3 babies now. And I've thought a number of times since how tough this would really be for them. Part of her unhappiness in Terry must have been, my God, am I going to do this less than 2 years for the rest of my life? And what was the answer? At that time, there wasn't much. That there were wives' tales and dangerous things that could be done, but there wasn't any real information. But my father, who was a prolific reader and read everything that he could get his hands on, had heard of Margaret Sanger. And he wrote her a letter and got the information they needed, and they were able to space their babies from then on. My sister was born when 6 years after my youngest brother. I was 8 when my sister was born, and I thought at the time that the reason that I finally got my sister, I got tired of being the only girl with these 2 boys, and we were it. There weren't other children around, so I thought maybe the reason it took so long is that the chicken wishbones that I always wished on, and I had my turn, I was always wished for a sister. So, but after I was married, I got the whole story. And I think that my dad carried on a correspondence with Margaret Sanger for a few years while she was going through the process of being in prison part of the time for her teachings. My father had, and mother both had a sense of social justice too. My mother, I must say, probably was mostly take care of yourself and your family, you know. But my father had a sense of social justice for the world. He had a great sense of, and other members of his family also did. By the time she was born, we had moved off the homestead for schooling. We never called anything home except the homestead. But there was a house for rent a mile from a real school, and that we could walk to, Highland School. That was, but I was probably 6 because they started us all fairly early, before, especially the boys. The boys both started when they were 5. And they started the year Clinton started the year he was 5, and my other brother too. But the first year, when he was ready for school, she went back to South Dakota. That's when she went back to South Dakota again. And I rather think that maybe that was one year that you probably have read about. There have been times when ranchers in eastern Montana, have found it necessary to ship some of their cattle out during very bad winters. And I think he took some of his livestock along and shipped them back to Webster for a few months during the worst of the year. And my brother got his first year of school. And I remember kindergarten, visiting my cousin's kindergarten one. But I didn't go to school there. But then the next year, we had a little school not close, probably nothing was close, but say 4, 5, 6 miles from our house. And it must have been a building that was not built for school, but it was a building that they could make a school out of. And there probably were maybe 8 kids from the community that could go, including the 3 of us. Because if they started my little brother at barely 5, then we 3 would be in, and maybe 3 to 4 other kids from other places. And my dad would take us in the wagon each time. And he'd go around and collect all the other kids to be sure that there were kids there. The teacher's name was Miss Wyatt, and she probably was maybe 18 years old, maybe a little older, but not much, because Montana was, eastern Montana particularly, was noted for teachers who had finished high school and maybe had 1 year of normal school. And Miss Wyatt was not a particularly good teacher. Normal school was teachers' college, what it would be. And I think it was expected that you should have 2 years of normal school and then you could start teaching and learn by experience. When we moved to the Hendrickson place, we called it. Isn't that, when I look back, I think it's strange that we never called that place home. The homestead was always home, and we adored that home. You know, if we were someplace else, we went to Webster. And when we went to Webster, we were awed by the trees. You know, beautiful trees on our grandfather's farm. And we liked it. We had fun with our uncles and cousins and all that. But we were always very, very happy to get back to, we called it the little greenhouse. And it was amazing how precious it was to us as little kids. They were so interested in having us schooled in getting a better education that they moved from the Homestead house to the Hendrickson place, and there was and there was farmland there that my dad could there was, let's see, how did they call it? There was land that had not been used before, and they call it breaking sod and breaking in new land. There was one plot that had many, many rattlesnakes. He would bring home several rattles from rattlesnakes because at the end of the day, there was an unwritten law that you killed every rattlesnake you could because you were benefiting other ranchers and the world by doing this. I mean, I think now we would think we don't want them to be extinct, but they were definitely the enemy because they were so poisonous. And near Highland School there was a rattlesnake pit that on very quiet days when we were on the playground we could hear the rattlers in that pit. That's just kind of interesting. And I think I remember, maybe it was a dream, but I think I remember going there and looking over the cliff and seeing the snakes crawl over each other. But we were snake wise. We knew to be careful, and we knew that they would rattle as a warning, and we knew how it sounded. It was a special rattle because we had enough of them from what my dad would bring home to know how it would sound, and we knew that they possibly wouldn't rattle in August because they were shedding their skin, so they somehow it interfered with being able to warn. So you had to be particularly careful in August. And it was all right for me to be scared. It was, you know, I was a girl and I had special privileges as well as many no-nos, you know, that I didn't get to do because I was a girl, but I also got special privileges. And one of them was that I got to be afraid if I was. Boys couldn't do that. They had to be unafraid of whatever. We spent most of our time outside in the summer, and because the whole area was our playground, you know, the hills, everything. And we had imaginary playmates, and we had stick horses. It was wonderful to get an old broom that wasn't being used. That was a particularly good stick horse. And we made our own ranches out of sticks and stones, mostly stones because there weren't many sticks because there weren't many trees around. So, but there were stones of all different shapes and sizes, and we could have this kind of stone be cattle and this kind of stone be horses, and we had our imaginary friends. There was one that could save us from anything, whose name was Dadden, and we never analyzed how close that was to Daddy, but but as a grown-up I did. And I suppose when I went to college in my first year of psychology, one word we did not know was bored. We didn't know there was such a word. It never would have been acceptable to ever say that you were bored. But besides the land that was in his name, there was all the range, and that was all free range. So his range animals were all, but they all had to be branded, so that they would, and so there was roundup each fall, so that or each spring after when the calves were and colts were a certain age, so that they could be branded and then turned loose again on the range. And that was always an exciting time. And we took it all for granted. My dad's brand was 3Z quarter circle. And we could read that and write it, and we had it on our pretend ranches, and it had to be, the top of the 3 had to be flat, and the 3 and the Z had to fit in the quarter circle. And that was the brand. We used to claim that our dad had 500 head of cattle and 300 head of horses. I don't know how many he had. I know that if he needed another horse, and he used to have workhorses, because he didn't have feed for them or barn for them, their feed was being turned out to graze on whatever grass that was available, and they had to cover territory to do that. So he had to have enough workhorses that he would work one team in the morning and one team in the afternoon. And my mother would say, yes, you go easy on the horses, but you don't go easy on yourself. And he would work the whole day, of course, with changing horses. So he would bring a horse in from the range, pick it out when they went on the roundup, and break the horse. And he always broke the horse. I mean, I'm sure that he wasn't considered as traditional as most of the homesteaders were, because he didn't just get on a horse and let it buck him. You know, he talked to it, and he tamed it, and he petted it, and he loved it, and before he ever put it in a harness or under a saddle. He had an old team named Dan and Barney, and they would wait at the fence for him each morning until he came out and spoke to them. When we left Montana, we went to Wyoming, and the ranchers around Cherry Creek and Terry in eastern Montana were all leaving because there wasn't enough rain to support, to make it financially possible to live there. Each year they would plant, and then the rains, and hope for rain, and when it didn't come, the crop would fail, and then they would borrow from the bank and plant again, and my dad was very stubborn, and he stayed and he stayed. And I remember one good year. Maybe there were others that were close to that, but there was one year when it rained and everything grew. Everything grew. We had the most remarkable most remarkable garden. That we had wagon loads of produce. And I remember, I have a memory, I probably was maybe 3 years old, of sitting on a pumpkin that my feet didn't touch the ground. It had reached that size. So, and there were watermelon, and it was a remarkable year. There was talk about where different people had gone. Some people had gone to Washington State, and some people had gone back to where they came from, Missouri and Kansas and so on. One couple that were very close friends went back to Minnesota, and my mother corresponded with them her whole life. So I have letters about, and they were all so very fond of this wonderful experience that they had in eastern Montana, that they were close friends because of it. Two couples had moved to the territory around Cody, Wyoming, and there was irrigation there, which seemed the answer. If you didn't get rain, you could irrigate, and so my father gave up his dream, and we just took all of this for granted and just moved with the flow, you know. But I think how awful it must have been for him to watch his dream filter away. So we moved to Wyoming and lived near Cody, Wyoming. We lived close enough to Cody that we could go to Cody schools. So we went to town school, no more country school.